Hello. We are going to continue our study of genetics this week as we look at Mendel's findings with his pea plants and use that information to allow us to start working through some Punnett square problems. So through Mendel's work with peas, he discovered and identified that parents pass on genetic information through genes. Genes are sections of your DNA that have instructions for some functional product, which is usually a protein or some RNA. He also identified that there are two genes for each characteristic that you have. One came from your mom and one came from your dad. If you happen to get the same type of that allele from both of your parents, you're considered homozygous. And if you got different alleles, you are heterozygous, homo being same and hetero being different. He also identified that the set of alleles that you get is considered your genotype or your type of genes, and the phenotype is what you actually look like or what characteristic you have. So last week you looked at some of your own personal traits, like when you fold your hands, what thumb, is on top, whether you have a widow's peak or a straight hairline, whether your little finger is bent or straight. Those are some things that we could look at in terms of phenotype, and then you identified your potential genotypes based on that. If you showed the recessive trait, you had to have two copies of that recessive allele, whereas if you showed the dominant trait, you could either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous because both contain that dominant trait. Mendel also determined that alleles are passed on randomly, so in the making of eggs and sperm, there is no rhyme or reason to which one gets passed on each time. But he also identified, as we looked at the traits earlier, not all alleles actually show up, so recessive traits can be hidden by a dominant trait. In order to discover this, Mendel worked with pea plants. He grew lots of peas and he crossed them the way that he wanted to do. So first he took the parent generation, he took tall plants, and he took the pollen from the tall plants and fertilized short plants with it. He let those grow and develop seeds, and ultimately he planted those seeds to grow more plants, and the first filial or first generation of kids were all tall. That was interesting, and he just identified that the short trait must be masked or covered up by the tall trait. So he took those tall plants and let them self-pollinate, and he grew those resulting seeds into plants and identified 3/4 of those as tall and 1/4 of them as short. So that again showed that the recessive smaller trait came back in that second generation. Every time that he looked at a trait, whether it was tall and short or purple and yellow flowers or round seeds and wrinkled seeds, he got the same sort of results. So he concluded that the separation of alleles occurs in a predictable mathematical way. We can explore that predictable mathematical outcome using Punnett squares. And as we solve Punnett squares over the next few days, we're going to be using a 5-step process for determining the offspring of a cross. To do this, each step that you do is going to be worth partial credit, so make sure you don't skip any of the steps. You may want to use notebook paper to complete your monohybrid cross worksheet that you have, because there isn't a whole lot of room on that sheet. The first step for every problem is to define the terms. So if you're crossing a tall plant and a short plant, you're going to use the term chart to find tall stem, big T. So you're going to use big T and little t. In the case of question 1 on your Punnett square sheet, you're looking at homozygous dominant green pod female with a heterozygous green pod male. So we're going to look for green pods, identify that we need the letter G. So we'll identify actually writing down that big G is green pod and little g is yellow pod. The second step is to identify the parent genotypes. And so in this case, it was identified that the female was homozygous dominant. So that would be a big G, big G. Homo is same and dominant is capital. The other parent, the male, is heterozygous, and that means it has to be different. So a big G and a little g. Again, this is step 2, and it does provide you with partial credit. Step 3 is to figure out what the possible gametes are. So what can mom and dad give in their eggs and sperm? In this case, the eggs can be either big G or big G. they're only going to pass on one of their traits as we undergo meiosis and pass on just one of those chromosomes. Dad is going to provide either a big G or a little g. We're going to put those on the outsides of the square representing the parent gametes. From there, we can fill in the square. And when we do fill in the square, we're going to take the big G from mom and the big G from dad and cross them here to get two big G's. This big G with this big G will give us the same. Now big G with little g here and big G with little g here. Technically, you could put the little g first, but it's easier to read it later if you always are consistent. If the capital is there, put it first. The final step is to determine the results. So what are the genotype ratios and phenotype ratios and the percentages or ratios of each? In this case, we had 2 of our 4 offspring, which are represented by these boxes, be big G, big G. So I've identified that 1/2 of them are big G, big G. 2 of the 4, 1/2 are big G, little g, or heterozygous, so they're listed there. In terms of phenotype, what do they look like? Because all of these have a big G, that means they all show that dominant trait, so they would be identified as 100% all green pod. So again, do each of these 5 steps each time you do a Punnett square problem. When you're working through your worksheet, you'll see the last questions don't use homozygous and heterozygous, but rather purebred and non-purebred. For purebred, that's synonymous with homozygous. Pure is all the same, and non-purebred is heterozygous or big and little. Again, all the terms you need are going to be listed on the back of this worksheet, so check there for the letters that you should be using for each problem. Good luck, and I hope it goes well. Feel free to, if you're still struggling, feel free to Google or go to YouTube and look for additional resources on solving Punnett square problems. Have a great day.